We don't believe that people of other faiths are going to hell unless they convert to Christianity.
Mm,
So
that's interesting.
that's totally the opposite direction of traditional understanding of the Christian faith. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another episode of the Identity Crisis podcast, where we endeavor to give an answer for the hope that lies within us, yet doing so with gentleness and respect. I am your co-host, Jalen Thompson.
Dylan Schweitzer.
Dill, what's the word, bro? How you doing, man? It's been a while.
Been a little while. We got a new setup.
Yeah, we'll get obvious, little virtual kick, but I think in person's better. But do what you got to do sometimes, right?
Yeah, we'll switch it up a little bit.
Yeah, so that's all good. So we got an interesting one today. How we came about it is kind of weird. We've been on this progressive Christianity kick for a little minute. We had a couple of recordings that we've done on it, and we decided to keep going down the rabbit hole. And honestly, through a Google search, just Google searching progressive Christianity, I came across a website for a church. This church is based out of Portland, Oregon. The name of the church is it's Bethel Congregational United Church of Christ.
Okay.
And this church is it's a progressive church. They make it pretty darn clear that that's what they are, that's what they do. And so I thought it would make sense to send that over to you. And I was like, hey, what do you think about this? And you were like, man, we ought to make an episode about it. Let's record it and kind of talk about it and see what we what we think about it, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and kind of see what their aim is and what they're ultimately trying to get at with this this progressive Christian movement.
Right.
Yeah. So let's dive into that. Right. So once again, this church is out of Portland, Oregon, and we're going to post the link to their church's website in the description of this episode so that you guys can go check it out, do what you see fit with it, go look at it. But first thing you see when you go on this website is pretty abundantly clear, is that this church is LGBTQ affirming. Make no mistake about it. It comes at you right away. Bill, what do you think about that? Like when that's like one of the first things you see?
When it's one of the first things that a church body is presenting on their website or as part of the front of their building,
yeah,
it's trying to make a clear line in the sand on where they stand, essentially. Because I mean, even if you did affirm that value of being okay with same-sex marriage and things like that as a church body, it probably wouldn't be like your core identity or a big part of your identity.
Sure.
But it seems like they're making some sort of stance or statement by doing so.
Yeah.
Part of it might be just that we're the cool, hip, progressive church and we're modern and things like that, and trying to cut themselves away from others. It could be trying to specifically target people in that demographic in the LGBT community. So it's kind of strange because I wouldn't really consider, even if you did affirm that, it's not really a core value of Christianity, so.
Yeah, it's interesting that you pointed that out, that it's not a core value of Christianity, yet this church, which claims to be Christian or at least Christ following at a foundational or fundamental level, they are aligning themselves with something that Christ, what we would say, traditional Christianity would say, taught against. They would say he was silent on the matter, and silent, thereby compliant with the matter.
Okay.
And so it's interesting that even if you take that approach that Christ was silent and thereby compliant with the matter, that you would plaster it everywhere.
Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach to it. But but that's one of the first things you see on this website. And so they have this we're kind of just walking through some of the major tenets of the website here. They have this big questionable letters. Why choose a progressive church? They got a paragraph underneath the deal. I'll read it here, and then
Okay.
I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So it says, it's a big picture of a rainbow with clouds underneath and rainbows in the background, so on and so forth. And the paragraph says, lots of churches teach Jesus' message of love and radical inclusion, but not all churches practice what they preach when it comes to diversity. Many have beliefs and bylaws that disqualify women from leadership positions, and many more deny membership to LGBTQ plus people. As a progressive Christian church, we do not discriminate against women or the LGBTQ plus community in hiring, leadership, or membership. We teach children, youth, and adults that love means treating all people as we ourselves want to be treated, regardless of gender, preference, identity, or expression. There are no glass ceilings at Bethel. Our Christian faith is 2,000 years old, but our thinking is not. What do you think about that?
Well, they got a little snarky at the end there, huh?
Uh-huh. I definitely saw that.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of walking through the phrase, lots of churches teach Jesus' message of love, of radical inclusion, but not all churches practice what they preach. That, to some extent, I think a lot of churches can agree. So, stating where we agree and where we disagree, I think is really important. I mean, a lot of people can say that there are church bodies, individually speaking, like local churches and such, where maybe they are preaching the gospel, maybe they are preaching about Jesus' teaching and everything, but the people that make up that community aren't really practicing these sort of teachings in general. I mean, that we could all agree with, and
Sure.
probably every church in the world does not practice the teachings of Christ perfectly. I don't think anyone can make that claim, no matter what faith tradition you come from within Christianity.
Right.
So to some extent, we can kind of all agree with that.
Yeah.
But they apply what that means in a more specific sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, what I would mean in a very general sense, if I was saying that, is I don't perfectly love my neighbor as myself. And that would be a very general way. I try my best to do that. I'm actively trying to get better at that. But that would be like one general sense in which I would say I don't fully live up to that teaching as best as I could or should.
Sure.
But they apply the radical inclusion and all that sort of stuff to be specifically in a modern equity DEI sort of perspective, meaning,
Yeah.
oh, well, they don't do Jesus' teaching because many local churches don't allow women to have leadership positions.
Okay.
And what they specifically mean is in the Orthodox or Catholic community, there are no female priests or deacons. And in a lot of the Protestant communities, there's not really a female pastor. There might be like a female minister and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of them, there's no like primary pastor. Though we're even seeing that change. But that's kind of a topic for another day. And so it's looked at as because there isn't an allowance for a primary leadership position for women in these church bodies. Therefore, they aren't following Christ's teaching, which is a whole other topic. I mean, whether or not there is biblical and historical support for women clergy and priestly roles and things like that. Right. I don't think there is. But if we grant that there isn't, it doesn't follow that therefore these church bodies are being exclusive or excluding people and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing that pops out at me with that section. Before I move on, is there anything in that regards to female leadership that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of your sentiments. I think it's very interesting how they led with something that is true. Like you said, lots of churches teach Jesus' message of love and radical inclusion. I think fundamentally that's pretty uniform within Christendom, right? But then they take a weird turn when they talk about churches not practicing what they preach when it comes to diversity. Right. And, well, wait a second. What do you mean by that? And that would, and what I've seen in a lot of progressive circles is a lot of the language that they use, it's language crafted in such a way that it's very hard to pin down definitions that can be used to structure a sound and coherent conversation.
Okay.
And so when they'll say something like diversity, what does that mean? And you'll get 50 different answers from, 40 different people. I said it that way on purpose.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the primary answer I hear is diversity in physical appearance, but not diversity in opinion.
Sure. But
that's the primary one I hear. Like, it's not so much concerned about diverse opinions, but whether or not we have people of different sexual orientations, and whether or not people of different skin colors and
sure.
genders, and there's a specific ratio of things, or people groups will say, in a given demographic or setting. Like, for example, if you have a work team, you got to make sure there's at least 3 black people, 2 Puerto Ricans, at least 1 gay person, or you're a bigot, and all getting the right numbers in all the category, not whether or not there's a diversity in opinion and in thought and in work ability. That's
sure.
the primary version of diversity that I am encountered with the sort of more progressive leaning perspective.
Me too. But I think even in that, though, that is what's manifested. That's not always what's defined verbally.
Okay.
And so they may say that they welcome different thoughts and opinions, right? But
no. Yeah, right. They may say that, but
right, they may say that. So that's what I mean when you ask to define it, they'll say it that way. But then when you watch it play out, or when you watch it pragmatically, that's not what it is. It's not diverse. It's not diverse thoughts and opinions. It's like you said. It's diverse skin colors. It's diverse sexual orientations. It's diverse genders. Because traditionally there are only 2, but now there are, I think, 70 plus. And so according to modern modern culture, there are about 70 plus. So that's traditionally what I've seen, is that they'll define it to where it sounds like it makes sense, but then pragmatically it does not look that way.
Sure.
And so I think that's kind of a little bit of what we have here when it comes to diversity. But moving along in the paragraph here, what do you think about the middle paragraph? I mean, it's in all bold on the website. It says, as a progressive Christian church, we do not discriminate against women or the LGBTQ plus community in hiring, leadership, or membership.
Yeah, I mean, I think we spoke enough about the women aspect of this a moment ago.
Yeah.
It seems like it's trying to make that just a clear stance on being extremely progressive, extremely LGBT affirming.
Yeah.
There could be many reasons for that, and I think one of the things that might be the reason for that, I'm not sure if it's in this paragraph, but they seem to be kind of setting themselves apart from like the opposite end, which would be like a very fundamentalist perspective.
Sure.
From Christian thinking.
Sure.
And that's what I see a lot with this stuff. And so, like, if we see
I think
the end of this sentence.
Yeah,
sorry?
I'll say I was going to bring up, I think what you're talking about is the last sentence, the third little paragraph there, where it says, our Christian faith is 2,000 years old, but our thinking is not.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one example of that sort of a deep contrast. It's like an overcorrection, essentially, is what they're doing, where it's this mindset that, primitive people back in the past thought this way, but we're progressing away from these harmful beliefs, is the sort of perspective that a lot of progressive Christians kind of adopt. I heard recently of this, like, Episcopalian priest or something. He might have been a Unitarian, I'm not exactly sure, but he basically said, I look at the Bible through the lens of love. If it's not loving, then it's not true. And then it's kind of a weird, lens to use, because, I mean, you're just kind of deciding what's loving or not. It's just kind of, what it really means is whatever I don't like is just not true. And that's just a stupid, forgive my condescension, but that's just a stupid framework.
No, I agree with you 1000%. But then also the question becomes, even before we start reading the Bible, it implies that we already know what love is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so what happens when the definition that you have of love goes against or is in direct contradiction to the definition that the Bible prescribes for love?
Yeah.
Would you consider the Bible's definition of love to be unloving?
Yeah, so that it brings up a whole other can of worms with that, where the standard is not the text; it's the
Yeah.
individual reading the text and reading into the text,
Right.
and that, of course, can be spun on in a million different problems in a million different ways. But in this specific instance, with that
Yeah.
example, you can kind of see the issue.
Yeah, we know that, don't we?
Right, right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean that's a little bit of thoughts on just this opening paragraph in general.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff gets brought up in other areas. So if you look on to the origins of progressive Christianity on this website, some of the ideas that they talk about is in keeping with our reformed and reforming identity. We have embraced a movement that began in 2006 called progressive Christianity. The movement was a part of a larger movement, the emerging church. At the heart of these movements was the desire to articulate a way of being Christian that was an alternative to the Christian faith portrayed in the public realm. And, that last sentence I can kind of agree with. Like, we could just say social Christianity or cultural Christianity in general.
Christian nationalism type of deal.
Sure, I wasn't quite going that direction. I just meant like a loose Christian belief. I go to church 3 times a year.
Okay.
I have vague Christian beliefs in
that's
general.
Okay, that's different. Yeah, that's different.
I believe in a God, and I go to church sometimes. That sort of perspective, or whatever is just portrayed in the media. I think a lot of us can agree, in a sense, that the Christian faith that's portrayed in the public realm is vastly different than the actual one. Especially when you just get people, especially like politicians, who will just claim a Christian name, but they're just kind of using it for a political bent. I think Donald Trump would be a great example of that. I'm not endorsing him or saying anything against him, but we could clearly say with some of his actions as an individual, not necessarily as a policymaker, that he's clearly not a Christian, but he, speaks Christianese when he needs to.
Sure. Yeah. I certainly wouldn't champion him as the model Christian. And like you said, I think that he, because of his policies, tend to err in favor of more
just conservative.
Yes, that's what I would say. Conservative ideals, which align more closely to biblical ideals. I think that people kind of gravitate toward him for those reasons. People who are Christians, people who are believers, gravitate toward him for those reasons. And I think as a politician whose number one job is to get elected and reelected, I think, like you said, he'll he'll use it where it makes sense, right? Just like the other guy who will use his Catholic faith when it makes sense.
Right. Yeah, but openly supports abortion. So it's like, what do you want us to do here? They're not our people. They're just claiming the team jersey, dude. Like,
yeah, that's all it is. So we agree there for sure. Then it kind of continues here that the leaders of progressive Christianity had grown weary of defining their Christian faith in negative terms. And then they say, we aren't fundamentalists. We don't believe the Bible is the inerrant or the infallible word of God. We don't agree that creationism should replace the science of evolution in public schools. We don't believe that God hates gays. We don't believe that people of other faiths are going to hell unless they convert to Christianity. We don't deny the rights of women to choose what happens to their bodies. So a lot there. So let's back up a little bit and kind of chop it piece by piece. So the we aren't fundamentalist piece. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, most Christians, well, I don't know about most, I'd say a good portion of Christians are not fundamentalist either.
Sure.
I look at what we might define fundamentalist, and you can tell me this is a good definition or not, is just someone who has just the basics and doesn't really think beyond that, thinks about Christianity in very, very unnuanced and simplistic ways. a lot of things, and there's some things that they talked about that kind of get smuggled into the creationist or into the fundamentalist perspective. Like, we don't agree that creationism should replace science of evolution in public schools. Well, whether or not you affirm evolution is kind of beside the point, but this what they're kind of sneaking in is creationism is usually synonymous with the term young Earth creationism, which means the Earth is 6,000 years old. Now, it doesn't. Not all young Earth creationists are fundamentalists, but typically, fundamentalists will have a sort of young Earth creationist perspective on
Yeah.
things. So
Yeah, that makes sense. I know a lot of these fundamentalists by how you've kind of framework the definition. A lot of these guys they have a hard time taking the Bible for anything other than literal.
yeah,
Yeah,
and it's funny because literal just means according to the text, which is why I always laugh when like, oh, you take the Bible literally, huh? And it's just like, well, I do take the text according to the text, yeah.
right.
But I would say like a hyper literalism or yeah, maybe hyper literalism is the best term.
Yeah, like an example would be like a guy who subscribes to this thought framework will probably believe that the Earth was created in 6 literal 24-hour periods of time.
Yeah, yeah. And so that would be a great example of that.
Yeah.
A lot of Christians, especially in the modern day, just don't believe that.
Yeah,
The term yom in the Hebrew text in Genesis 1 and through 3 can be viewed as a day, but back then, day wasn't defined as a 24-hour day.
yeah. It's actually more like a
nighttime, the daytime. It could be viewed as a variety of different things for that term yom.
Yeah, and even traditionally in Jewish understanding of the word day, it was from I believe 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening.
Yeah, that's a 12-hour period.
Yeah, and so that's 12-hour period. So different ways, but so they're not fundamentalists. Okay, understood. We don't believe the Bible is the inerrant or infallible Word of God.
And not to sound snarky, but like we're kind of not surprised.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean this is probably the one thing. One or two things on here that's kind of smuggled in that's like a belief that most Christians have, and it's kind of put in this category in a somewhat derogatory sense. Like, we aren't fundamentalists. We don't believe the Bible's inerrant. And that's not really a fundamentalist only perspective. I would say most Christian faith communities have that belief to some extent. They might nuance what they mean by inerrant and infallible to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, typically people in this progressive background are coming from a fundamentalist, simplistic perspective on all this stuff. So instead of looking at some of these other perspectives, they just go in the complete opposite direction.
Sure. And I guess what I would question a progressive Christian to answer is, okay, you don't believe that the Bible is the inerrant or infallible Word of God, then what is it?
Right, and you get a variety of answers, but I'm trying to think of one that I've heard recently. It's like Brandon Robertson might be a good example. He's a progressive pastor online.
Sure.
And he would say that it's like maybe spiritually authoritative, but the text isn't inerrant. He takes the Bible very seriously because he goes to school for the Bible and so on and so forth. So I would say it's just up there for importance, but you kind of have to sort through what's correct and what's not correct because the text was written by men is the sort of perspective that might, get shared in general.
Right.
But I mean, most of the, all the books that I've read, they were written by people, and I trust a lot of those. So I don't know why the Bible gets a special category where it's immediately demoted because of its human authorship. Maybe it's because it claims so much authority in its text, and it's been used in its authority, used for authority. People are just, instead of addressing the authority issue, like maybe someone wielding the text in a tyrannical way, instead of dealing with that issue, they just dismiss the text itself as being truly authoritative.
Right. Yeah, and I've had a similar experience to you with books. The vast majority of the ones that I read were written by humans.
Oh wow.
So yeah, shocking. And so I'm not quite sure what to do here.
Yeah.
But no, like you said, this isn't surprising at all, right? This is very fundamental to the progressive Christian belief that they can't possibly hold the Bible in such a high regard, because if they did, they'd have no legs to stand on as it relates to how they interpret it.
Right.
And so then they have this next sentence here. We don't agree that creationism should replace the science of evolution in public schools.
Yeah, and again, this is kind of using the term young earth creationist. That's usually what creationism means, just to specify.
Yep.
And because what will happen is this term creationism is assigned to anyone with a sort of Judeo-Christian worldview.
Mm-hmm.
But creationism is usually something very specific, which is young earth creationism, literal 6 days,
Right.
6,000-year-old planet.
Yeah.
And just, most Christians just don't affirm that, whether it's today. Throughout history, that specific six literal days, 6,000-year-old planet, that has not been a predominant or majority view of Christians throughout history. We could look at church fathers like Augustine, Origen. I mean, we could put up a whole list. I didn't come prepared with that today, but we can always provide that in the future. That just don't affirm that. And they had different views. Now, they didn't have 13.4 billion or whatever the number is for the most scientific research. They thought of something bigger than 6,000, though, because they used the data that they had at the time to calculate so and so. And I think the big thing is just the Bible's not a science book. It's not a textbook. It's a book about the history of mankind in relation with God. And so, and it's especially those first 11 chapters, it's a very specific genre of history called, sometimes referred to as mytho-history, though I think that genre name isn't very helpful. I used to just refer to it as like poetic history. It's telling something that happened in a very abstract, nuanced, and somewhat allegorical way. So something like this happened. It may not have been exactly verbatim how it's written, in terms of like a hyper-literalism of the text.
Right.
But if you read it in a hyper-literal sense, the more fundamentalist perspective, that's on the reader, not on the text itself. And so, getting back to the main point, most Christians don't say that, for at least from my knowledge, I shouldn't speak for all Christians, but the idea that creationism shouldn't replace the science of evolution, even just to make that simpler, creationism shouldn't replace science. It's like, no, I don't think we should be teaching the Bible in science class, because it's science class. Whatever the up-to-date research on science is, just talk about that. That seems to be the most straightforward thing, because the Bible's kind of in its own category. Science is kind of in its own category. They're not at odds with each other. There's no Christian dogma that is in conflict with any scientific thing going on. So there's no need to pin these against each other. They actually dovetail nicely into each other.
Yeah, which is why a lot of the latest advancements and pushes in modern science have been pioneered by theists, Christian scientists as well. So we certainly don't believe that. And like you said, I like how you pointed out how the Bible is not a science book. And so we should really stop trying to use science to poke holes in the Bible. And that's
it's just goofy.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. You're at a gunfight with a butter knife. And so the next sentence here, we don't believe God hates gays. Well,
neither do we.
Neither do we. However, I do want to point something out though that it just popped in my head as I just read it. You can see the identification crisis in the sentence. We don't believe God hates gays, as opposed to saying something like, we don't believe God hates people who practice homosexual behavior.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
I find that interesting that they phrased it that way, that we don't believe God hates gays. Well, is that all that's to them?
Right.
It's as though that's what they're saying is that is them. What they do is who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly not what any of us believe. So I guess we're in agreement there. But I guess when I phrase it in the way of we don't believe that God hates people who practice homosexual behavior, there's now a distinguishment from the person and the behavior, right? And so we can say, yeah, we believe that God hates people. We believe that God hates homosexual behavior, but God doesn't hate people.
Right.
That makes sense.
Sure.
But the way that they phrase it here, they don't leave room for that.
Right. And it's possible they just used. I do 100% agree with your assessment, but it's also possible that they use this phrase because maybe the what's what I'm looking for. The extreme juxtaposition that they're taking, this extreme overcorrection, is maybe they've heard that phrase before from a very fundamentalist perspective. We don't hate gays. Saying maybe someone in their life said we hate gay people or something like that, or the gays or something, and so they're maybe they're just doing that super overcorrection. It seems like they're trying to make a sort of safe place for people who have a some sort of loose Christian belief system, but also have a very, very progressive perspective on things, whether it's politically or theologically, or maybe they're just in the LGBT community, so they're trying to just over emphasize how much of a safe space this is at their congregation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, at least that's the sort of vibe I get from reading all this stuff.
Me too. And then we got two more here. We don't believe that people of other faiths are going to hell unless they convert to Christianity.
So that's interesting.
That's totally the opposite direction of traditional understanding of the Christian faith.
Yeah, I mean, why don't you share your thoughts on that first? I'm curious what that brings to mind for you.
Well, for me, because I mean, I guess in a way you got to go back to what they said about them not believing that the Bible is the inerrant, infallible Word of God, because Jesus makes some pretty bold claims about himself and about God. Obviously, him being God incarnate, and he made some pretty bold claims about himself. He said things like, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except by me." That sounds pretty explicit to me. That there is no way to God except through me. You have to deal with me, which will make sense, seeing how he's God incarnate. But here they're saying we don't believe that people of other faiths who directly contradict Jesus or who are opposed to Jesus are going to hell unless they convert to Christianity. But that's kind of what he said.
Yeah, I might nuance that a little bit differently.
We can. I'm dealing with it on a 10,000-foot level.
Sure.
But we can nuance that, but I'm dealing with it on a 10,000-foot level right now because to me, Jesus presents a pretty polarizing case in regards to how you are to deal with him. And he doesn't leave a lot of room for other faiths.
Yeah, he doesn't say, I am one of many paths, or I'm an option you can take if you're feeling it.
Right.
He says, I am the way, I am the path.
Right.
And so that is a radical claim. And so if you do have a perspective where you can kind of dismiss the text at different parts as just saying, this is just inaccurate based on what the initial teaching of Jesus was. Mm-hmm. He didn't actually write that. I think this part of the text is wrong, or just dismissing the text in general in different areas and stuff like that. You can kind of take that perspective where a passage like that in the book of John or in other areas that seem to lay out this radical exclusionism, it's really easy to just say, well, obviously God is love. I'm going to agree with that part of the Bible, and I don't think that's very loving, so I'm not going to affirm that. Got it.
And then last sentence here is we don't.
Well, the last thing. One thing I wanted to nuance with that little section really quick. I think there's two primary beliefs on this sort of thing in a more what's the word? We'll just say traditional Christian perspective on this. One is just like a stark, like if you aren't, if you don't come to my independent Baptist church, you ain't saved. You ain't going nowhere but there. And so there is this sort of like, and like, for example, they would also say Catholics are going to hell because they preach a false gospel.
Which is insane.
Right. And so you do get some of that in Christianity that is somewhat prevalent, I would say. I think that aspect is somewhat on the head, where unless you were at a specific church or something like that, and if you're a part of this church, then you're definitely not going to heaven and stuff like that. But I think another perspective that's also prevalent is that no one is saved apart from Christ, but that doesn't always mean that someone's going to have an explicit Christian faith exactly how it's supposed to be articulated, whether it's some things that are just a little bit wrong, or even just like not knowing about Christianity. So if you think about like a guy on a desert island, doesn't ever hear the gospel, never has a Bible, never hears about Jesus,
Sure.
But follows his conscience perfectly and tries his best to live in accordance to truth and good values and everything. Yeah. He's going to be in a very different position than Genghis Khan, obviously. If you don't have an opportunity, we would call this invincible ignorance, to act on the Christian message, it's kind of hard to be held accountable for that. And
Sure.
so we could bridge this out into other areas where we could say Christianity is the fullness of that truth. We could say other religions are participating in that truth to some extent, but they're clearly lacking fundamental things. The primary thing is being an explicit teaching of Christ. So like you could say Judaism, and then Muslims, and then Hindus and Buddhists, and so on and so forth. You can kind of work your way out where you can kind of see a path that's starting to narrow towards Christ. I mean, obviously the Judaic faith is much closer to the Christian faith than, a pagan in the woods worshiping idols, and obviously all of those are a lot different than a radical materialism.
Sure.
And so I think people are going to be judged based on the revelation they have, and it's going to work like that. But if they get saved and go to heaven and did not have an explicit Christian faith or weren't in the perfect sort of intellectual headspace or whatever it might be, didn't adhere to a certain adherence of facts, which is kind of a silly way to look at faith, but that's a topic for another day. They're still going to be saved through Christ. It's just not going to be in the way that we would typically think about it. So that's the way I would kind of nuance that. It's a little complicated to wrap your head around. Now I'm not saying that everyone will be saved if they're just trying their best or whatever like that. But I would say, like a Jewish person who hasn't heard of Christ is in a very different position than a materialist atheist who's actively making atheist YouTube videos against Christianity and stuff like that. I mean, that's clearly just a different position.
No, for sure, and I appreciate you nuancing that. I was more so approaching it from a in my example that I gave. I was kind of implying that a person had heard of Christ, a person it was at least aware of Christ, and decided to intentionally not follow him, and participate. Other faiths.
And that's the other tricky thing, because if the only version of Christianity they get is the fundamentalist perspective and how he hates gay people or whatever sort of just like gross coding they put over the gospel, did they really hear Jesus' teachings? Did they really hear his voice?
Yeah,
I would argue they didn't.
Yeah, I would too. I would too. What's interesting about our time in particular that we're in, is we can come up with a million different examples of exceptions to the general rule, but the reality is, in the time that we live in, we are very privileged to have access to an enormous amount of information. To where even with bad experiences or poor representations of Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or whatever you want to call it, if you want to sort through it, you can.
Sure.
In the time that we're in now, especially here in the West, like we brought up the example of the man on the island who never heard of Christ and things like that. God is just and will deal with him according to the information that he has. Versus Jalen and Dylan probably will get dealt with a little differently.
Right.
And so, generally speaking, and here in the West in particular, we don't really have these parameters. We have experientially we might, but even in experiences with poor representations of Christ, we still have access to information, as well as access, maybe even access to people. If you're willing to go look for it, because I'm very convinced that if you go looking for God, you'll find them. That would contradict those poor representations and provide more accurate representation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to clear that up, but and then there's this last sentence here is we don't deny the right of women to choose what happens to their bodies,
Which is a euphemism for we support abortion.
right? And I always find it funny when they word it that way. Women's right to choose what happens with their bodies. Like, isn't that how they got pregnant in the first place? That makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So then they got these 5 progressive beliefs, these 5 kind of core beliefs here, and then we'll wrap up. So the first one, the Christian faith is founded on 3 primary calls we see through Jesus: to love God, to love our neighbor, and to love ourselves.
Yeah, and it's funny because this is kind of hinting back to when Jesus talks about how you could sum up all of the commandments in 2 primary ways.
Yeah.
To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of left a lot out. First one, and to love your neighbor as yourself. But he doesn't say there's a third one saying to love ourselves. Now, clearly, you should love yourself, but and I'm glad they put it in this order. It wasn't like love ourselves, love our neighbor, and maybe love God. So, points to them there, putting a pretty good order in. But I worry that this sort of idea of having a core tenet being to love yourself is going to be looked at. It sounds really good. You should love yourself, but It might looked at as getting in the way of what's properly in place in your hierarchy of values.
Sure, and even in the command, to love our neighbor as ourselves, it is implied that you already love yourself.
Right.
That and it's almost like that's part of the problem. It's like if I can get you to love someone else as much as you love yourself, then we'll make some progress here, right?
Right.
That's kind of what's implied in the commandment here. So for them to kind of throw it in there as a third primary call, I see it as a little deceptive, which most of this stuff is. But
it's very modern mental health.
Sure. Which we obviously
and so maybe it's probably taking it, like, I think it means well.
Sure.
I think it means well.
I
but I think it's our faith is 2,000 years old, and I think our thinking should be 2,000 years old, not 12.
Right.
Because when it's 12 years old, we get stuff that's just very modern and trying to shoehorn it into Christianity,
sure.
And it's just not really there.
Right.
And that doesn't mean you abandon modern teaching in the scientific or the psychological realm and things like that.
Right.
It's just it just feels kind of shoehorned into this perspective. It's like Jesus never talked about love yourself. It's not a primary teaching. But of course, of progressive beliefs, it makes sense because it's a progressive ideology.
Right.
It's trying to move away and move towards something new, whatever that might be.
True.
And they're going to incorporate many things outside of Christian teaching, but put it under the umbrella and say, yeah, well, Jesus is obviously about this because God is love.
Yeah, makes sense. And so then you got number 2 here. The Christian faith is our way of being faithful to God, but it is not the only way. Christianity is the truth for us, but it is not the only truth.
Yeah, and I mean, we kind of touched on this a moment ago about Jesus's claims of radical exclusionism.
Sure.
He is the only way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except through him. That's a very, very radical claim. And I've already kind of touched base on what that means a moment ago in terms of what that actually looks like, what it means to be saved by Christ, and all of this.
Yeah,
I feel like we kind of already addressed that. Luckily.
We did. I agree. We did. And then so you got 3 here. Belief 3. The love of God involves all aspects of life, not just human life. Care of the earth and its ecosystems is an expression of Christian faith and stewardship.
Yeah, I mean, and we are called to be stewards of the planet. I mean, that's one of the
Agreed.
things we see in the beginning of Genesis.
Mhm.
Right after Adam and Eve are brought together, they're brought together not just so they could have a love fest, but so they could be fruitful and multiply, and I think it's bring dominion over the earth. And so that doesn't mean a tyrannical subjugation of the planet to your hedonistic whims. It's you're supposed to take care of what's been given to you. You're supposed to help maximize its goodness.
Mhm.
The planet, God made the earth and it was good.
Right.
It wasn't exactly written like that, but it's pretty explicit from the creation narrative in the
Yeah,
beginning,
absolutely.
that what God makes is good, and so He uses human beings to bring about more goodness.
Mhm.
And so we can all agree with that. I think what's smuggled in here is love of God involves supporting the modern doctrine of climate change, and
Yeah.
so
Man,
that's what's kind of moving.
now we're having a different conversation, right?
Yeah,
And in some progressive circles, some more liberal circles, which is usually where you find progressives, progressive Christians, I should say, it can even be kind of said as save the planet at the expense of human life.
yeah, exactly. And so you'll kind of get this human exclusivist perspective where people who often support climate change will say things like, well, there's too many people on the planet. And it's like, well, who are you offering to go? Like, are you raising your hand? Are you saying other people
Absolutely
got to
not.
go? Is it just the poor people? Is it just
Right.
the black people in Africa? Who are
Right.
you saying got to go?
Right.
And so I would say helping the planet to thrive, because the planet doesn't need saving. It needs us to just take care of it properly.
Right.
Helping the planet to thrive, not at expense of human beings, is the mindset that it is. So if we are, in fact, over polluting and there are things we can do to help, hey man, I'm first in line to do what it takes within reason to accomplish that. But going green just for the sake of being green is just kind of silly. If it's something that's going to actually lead to the thriving of the planet and of human beings, personally, I'm all for it. And whatever that looks like, I just don't like how climate change gets turned into a sort of red alert sort of doctrine,
Mm.
and anything that goes against our perspective, we can kind of put it under this umbrella, and we put poor people at expense, and that's what personally worries me. But just to get back to the primary, foundational element above it, which they seem to be about caring for all, not just human life, all life. We should take care of the planet. We should take care of other life on the planet because we are stewards. I mean, generally, Christians should all agree on that.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. It's just what gets smuggled in with those loosely defined terms that become the problem, right? Kind of
Right.
going back to my original point earlier with my issue with progressive Christianity and the coherency of conversation.
Yeah. Like kind of like a moment ago, we believe that women have a right to choose what happens to their bodies. Like we do too. I just don't think you should kill children. It's like, so.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're just saying we support abortion, just say that.
Yeah, exactly.
We
Yeah.
believe in healthcare for women. It's like, no, like obviously, like no one's going to disagree with that sentence.
Right.
But what that sentence means in your specific context is the slaughtering of young babies. So it's just like, say what you mean and mean what you say, and then we can have a conversation. This is one of those things where on the surface, the no nonsense meaning of it, we can all agree with. It's just if you mean a specific modern climate change perspective, it's like, well, that's just not. I don't think that's a core tenet of Christianity if you affirm
Right.
climate change or not. It's
Absolutely.
more of the meta ethical framework behind it that's important. And so, yeah, that's kind of my perspective on it.
Yeah. So then you got number 4, right? Love of neighbor means extending kindness and care to those in our family and in our local and global communities. Further, love of neighbor includes affirmation of the LGBTQ community, immigrants, people of other faith traditions, and even those who are enemies.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, love of neighbor means extending kindness and care. Sure, it does. Your camera went off there, deal.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that makes sense, right? In a general sense, right? On the surface, that sounds like it makes sense. It absolutely doesn't mean extending kindness and care. But then when they get into this, furthermore, love of neighbor includes affirmation. Well, now we run into a problem, right? Because if me loving you means that I have to affirm the choices that you want to make, be they good choices or sinful choices, godly choices, I should say, or sinful choices. Now we're getting into a bastardized, self-centered definition of what love truly is, and
Yeah.
and we have to forsake the biblical framework that's prescribed for love, and for this more modern take, so that we can sprinkle a little bit of Jesus on top of our sin, and call it holiness, right? Essentially, that's what we do. And so, to love someone does not mean to affirm them. And I can assure you of this, as a father of a 2-year-old. If I affirmed every decision that my daughter wanted to make, she probably would be 2 years old right now. Just in a very real practical sense, they make really bad decisions, and if you're not there to correct them, lovingly correct them, you correcting them uh, is actually evidence that you love them in a more sacrificial, selfless way, which I think is more closely to the traditional Christian understanding of what love truly is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell if they just in this sentence if they mean affirmation of the LGBT community, and affirming immigrants, and affirming other faith traditions, and affirming enemies, or if they just mean affirming in the first one. I'm assuming they just mean affirming in the first one here. So I mean, like, it's kind of presupposing that like Christians don't like immigrants, which is kind of like a silly. It's just like, what?
I don't even know
Again, it's taking a very specific sliver of this sort of popularized, modern political Christianity.
I've never even heard of that. I've never even heard of that. That Christians didn't like immigrants. I've never heard of that. Now, I mean, if you're going the route of the more political Christian conservative route of hey, get out of my land type of, unless you're going that route, okay, I can't say anything about that. But traditionally speaking, I've never understood Christianity to speak negatively against immigrants.
Yeah, they're taking a very modern lens and a sliver that doesn't represent the whole. And even then, like, even most conservative Christians, whatever the heck that means today, it's usually an emphasis on illegal immigrants. And so, I mean, technically we're all immigrants to this country except the Native Americans. So,
right.
I mean, it's just it's silly. Again, it's taking this very specific sliver and juxtaposing their identity against themselves, against that sort of community. No Christian hates people of other religions, so going to the other faith traditions, and we're called to love our enemies. So I mean, it's just kind of silly to lump all those things in with the affirming of the LGBT community. I would say if you firmly believe that God does not condone an LGBT lifestyle, for lack of better terms, and I actively know that, and you're someone who's asking me my opinion on what God thinks, I'm at an obligation to tell you what I believe to be true. It would not be very loving of me to lie to you.
Agree.
In any circumstance. And so I would hope if I was doing something and I asked for their honest opinion, they would actually give it to me. Now, this is much different. This scenario that I'm prescribing is much different than going on the street corner and saying gays are going to hell, right? Which might be what someone has in their mind if you don't affirm LGBT community. I personally do not affirm the LGBT community. And one of the ways that I don't affirm it is if for example, if I come in contact with someone who is trans and they have a different name than their birth name, I'm probably let's use something simpler. If they use pronouns that are not in line with their actual pronouns.
Okay.
I will not use their pronouns, but I'm also not going to use the pronouns they don't like.
Uh-huh.
I wouldn't refer to them as sir or ma'am. I would say the individual here would like X, Y, and Z. And so I'm still going to be kind and helpful to them. I'm not going to use something that I know they don't like, but I'm also not going to use something that I know is untrue.
Sure.
And so there's a line between not crossing my own values and still being respectful of the individual, and not going out of my way to be rude, you know?
Sure.
Because I could be rude over and over and be like, oh, are you sure, sir? Are you sure, sir? I could just to be instigated.
It's not productive. It's not productive.
And it's just not nice. I mean, obviously, if someone is struggling with gender dysphoria and they don't like those pronouns, why would I go out of my way to use them? It's just being rude. But at the same time, I'm not going to support a lie.
Right.
So I'm not going to use the pronouns you want me to use. Mm-hmm. I just won't use pronouns in my sentences, and that'll be my polite way to reject what you've asked me to do. So I'm not going to affirm you, but I'm not going to be rude either. Is the sort of perspective that I take on that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not going to affirm you, but I'm not going to be rude.
Yeah, makes sense. And I agree with you there. You actually provided a nice little practical piece of wisdom there with the maybe instead of using the pronoun, saying the individual. That's a nice respectful way to, like you said, keep your boundaries and your values intact, while at the same time having a healthy, productive interaction with the individual that may be struggling with gender dysphoria. Because you never know. You may very well be the person that helps this individual to have an encounter with Christ through this interaction, right? And you don't want to leave a smudge on the mirror, if you will. With those types of interactions. So then this last one, love of self means engaging in spiritual disciplines. Worship, prayer, music, study of the Bible, and other literature feeds the mind, heart, and spirit. Love of self also includes giving time for rest, recreation, nurturing friendships, a healthy diet, and physical exercise. Love of self requires humility and humor.
Yeah, I mean, on the face value of this all sounds great, and it's good to do.
Sounds great.
I think part of it is love of self, but I don't think these actions are the primary motivation to do all of these things. Like, I don't worship God because I love myself, for example.
Right.
I think they're coming from a good place when they say this, but if my love of self is engaging of the spiritual activity of worship, that just seems silly to me. I'm going to worship God only or primarily because I love myself. That's just narcissistic, and I don't think it's intended to be that way, but it's very clearly written that way.
Yeah, and if you were to engage in that, I suppose, essentially, would that be essentially the worship of yourself in a way? If at the
pretty much
if at the core of it is the love of myself, well, then isn't that what the object of my worship is?
Right.
It's not really God. It's more so God, worshiping myself vicariously through God. Kind of, something of that kind of sort.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and like you said, it's just narcissistic and it doesn't work. But on the surface, like you said, things like giving time for rest, it's good for you. Recreation, it's good for you. Friendship, love it. Healthy diet and physical exercise, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just straightening out the hierarchy of values at the end of the day. You should do these things also because you love yourself. But like some of these are just like if the only reason I pray to God is because I love myself, that just seems kind of strange. I wouldn't say like prayer isn't just like a cool, trendy activity I do to get me in the mood before work.
Right.
It's a proper way of orienting my life towards fundamental goodness.
Right.
And I have a baseline responsibility to at least communicate with God in a personal manner, is what I would say. And I don't mean responsibility and like, oh, it's something I have to do. It's something I get to do. And it's a proper mode of orienting my life. And so, if I love myself, I would be wise enough to worship God. We could say that. But that can't be the driving motivation, I would say.
Agreed. And it's also implied. To me, when they use the term worship, it seems like it's more in the sense of using it as a verb, like worship is an activity. However,
yeah, that's a very modern evangelical term.
Yes.
For worship, like worship is the slow music during church,
hands lifted, so eyes closed, so on and so forth. But from what I understand, traditionally speaking, throughout church history, worship has been far more than that. And far more, far deeper and nuanced than just the lifting of my hands and the closing of my eyes. It has more to do with the heart, the soul, and the mind oriented toward Christ than just this physical activity. Now, don't get me wrong; the physical activity is a part of those things, but worship in and of itself is something far deeper than that physical activity. That physical activity is more of a how will I put it, a symptom of a deeper meaning of worship, which would be, like I said, a life oriented in totality towards God.
Mm-hmm. Love it.
Yeah. So those are the 5 beliefs for this church. What do you guys think for this episode? I mean, this is an interesting church here, an interesting website. Like I said, we're going to post a link for it. We'll
tag them, let them know that we did a whole video just for them.
Absolutely, we'll tag them. They aren't the only church in town. We live in Illinois, which is home to Chicago, and so we're pretty familiar with the progressive Christian movement. Maybe that's what we should do. We should do a Chicago church. I'm sure we could have found one.
There's one right by my house.
Yeah, and then I've passed several of them. I've been working in Chicago all the time for my job, and I've passed several of them. That's what we should have done. But anyway, anything else on this episode, man? Anything else on this topic?
I think we covered everything that needed to be covered.
Sounds good, my friend. Well, until next time, I am your co-host, Jaden Thompson.
Dylan Schweitzer.
And as always, for the kingdom,
we
out.